Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. I'm here for a video interview with Tyler Cooper, editor-in-chief of Broadband Now. We're back. We were here last month talking about some really exciting open data that Broadband Now had recently released. But today we're going to be talking about a new report that Broadband Now has just issued on gigabit coverage. Massive gigabit coverage increase highlights how unreliable government broadband data can be. So with me to discuss this topic is Tyler Cooper. Welcome, Tyler. How are you doing?
Thank you. Doing well, Drew. Happy to be here.
Well, very excited to review this, and obviously we will provide a link to this report from the page that we post this sponsored interview. Tyler, tell me just a little bit about what the headline here is. The FCC is claiming 84% gigabit coverage, and you're saying, no, that's not correct. It's actually 56%. So why did you, I guess I should say, what did you find? And then how did you investigate whether it really was the truth?
Certainly. So let me back up real quick and say, so one of the main reasons that we even decided to do this was that over the past year, we've noticed an uptick in consumers reaching out to us on our own site and complaining that gigabit service was available on paper at their address, but whenever they called, it wasn't. And that became so common that, obviously we've done a lot of reporting around the FCC's 477 and availability data and where service is and isn't available, but nothing specific to gigabit. And since this topic just has been getting so much attention, I thought it would be interesting to sort of take a cross section of a few states and see, just how accurate the gigabit expansion was in particular, because it's something that I think will be increasingly important as time goes on. As a metric. So yeah, what we did is we looked at...
Let me stop you there for a quick second, because it might be useful to kind of make sure those who are watching this video, whether on Broadband Breakfast or Broadband Now or elsewhere, are acquainted with why the gigabit benchmark is so important. In some ways, it's kind of seen as future-proof. Maybe we won't see it that way in 10 years or 5 years from now, but tell me why gigabit is kind of regarded as an important benchmark from your perspective, Tyler.
Sure, yeah, that's a good question, and it certainly gets into the territory of the aspirational, I think. But the way I view gigabit service is it's a connectivity threshold that is, if you look at it purely from a utilitarian perspective, it's overkill right now, right? I mean, there are very few applications that the average person, requires a gigabit connection for today in 2020. But as you were saying, speeds, functionality of the internet and the Internet of Things and any device that uses a network is rapidly evolving. This is something that's changing every single day. 5G is here now. We're already seeing, talks about 6G. We're seeing these clustered networks starting to sprout up in major cities. A lot of talk around, the sort of smart infrastructure of tomorrow, which is actually starting today in many countries. All of these things right now can make use of a gigabit connection. But like you were saying, in 10 years, who knows? I mean, that will likely be far closer to what is required to really take advantage of some of these technologies. And so I think that one problem we've had in America for a long time is not being proactive enough when we're planning broadband infrastructure, right? We talk a lot about, how to get people connected, how to close the digital divide. But I think oftentimes these solutions end up being solutions for today and not for tomorrow, right? We have a lot of focus on the present moment, which is important. But I think that, we do ourselves a disservice by not sort of thinking more long-term about the infrastructure we're building and how we're prioritizing technologies. Because, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that the pandemic of the last year has really helped make the case for the need for high, or at least much higher, upstream speeds, right? Some networks, some non-fiber networks provide high downstream, but have very constrained upstream speeds. And when we're talking gigabit, we almost always are talking symmetrical gigabit, not always, but many or most of the time. I, for example, after 10 or more years of evangelizing the importance of gigabit connectivity over the last 6 months, finally have a symmetrical gigabit connection in my home. And I'm very grateful for that. Even, FTP and other things still takes a long time. So I am very, very happy for it. And I appreciate, talking about the importance of this, because it really is increasingly seen as vital, even if it is kind of on the pure metrics, a little bit of overkill. So thanks for walking through that. Anything else you want to say before we get into like what you actually did to prove out or disprove this 84.4% number?
No, I think that's good. I mean, I also just joined the symmetrical gig bandwagon about 3 months ago. So yeah, so I understand what you mean. It's certainly good.
So the FCC has claimed, according to your report, that there was 4% of the country that could get gigabit service in 2016 and 84% in 2020. And you said, is that true? Tell us what you investigated and what you found.
Certainly. So yeah, this is going to be likely some review for both of our audiences, but so this number is based on the FCC's 477 deployment data. So providers essentially report where they offer service and at what threshold. And when looking at the data, so the FCC now says that essentially most of us can get a gigabit connection if we want it. And that, just as a gut check, doesn't feel right. I mean, if you sample 5 people in your life, it's likely that several of them cannot get gigabit connections. So it's like, just seeing that number on its face is a bit alarming and surprising. So, I mean, that was a big part of it, but also, again, just seeing the uptick in consumers saying, hey, we see that this is available, but it's not, it's not available at our house. And up until recently, that was the case for me personally. It's the case for my dad currently, who lives about 20 minutes north of me in Dallas. He has gigabit service, but on paper, but it does not have it to his address. So this is something that it's easy to talk about, and it's easy to say, yeah, gigabit service may not be as, accessible as it seems, but it's hard to really kind of dig in and qualify, what that means. And so what we did is we took sort of a different approach to quantifying where gigabit service was, where we have a national database of plans and pricing from all the providers in the US. And the backbone of this is built on 477 data, but then we obviously have more updated data from providers themselves that gets, basically implemented into our data set on a rolling basis. But basically what we did is we looked specifically at a few zip codes where the FCC's data shows that gigabit coverage has been reported. So this is the latest FCC release. So the data that we used comes from June 2016 to 2017, 2017 to 2018, 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020. So those are like the releases we use to create the year over year estimates as reported by the FCC. And essentially what we did is we took a random sample of 5 zip codes from 3 states, so Texas, Florida, and Ohio, trying to sort of space it out across the country to see if we could create a more accurate portrait of what might really be available. And we sampled random addresses from several zip codes in these states that, again, on paper should have gigabit service. And basically, we just did a manual check. So we manually, first we went on the website. If the provider had a website where you could check address level availability, we checked there. If it was able to be confirmed, yes or no, we took that at their word. If not, we actually manually called the provider and tried to do a check that way and manually see if the address had gigabit service, like an active gigabit plan that you could sign up for. And we did this for 75 addresses across the country. And, this is something I would like to repeat with far more, but this is something, that we just did as a sort of exploratory first step. And it was an interesting one because we found that none of the addresses that we called actually had an active gigabit plan as of 2020. Yeah.
So none of these 75 you called had it. So how do you get to the 56% number that you estimate as having gigabit service?
Right. So that number is based around plans. So we sort of use the FCC's numbers as a baseline, but then add in our own data set and say, okay, so of these areas that have been marked as census blocks that report gigabit coverage, which ones of them in our database actually show an active gigabit plan. So which do we have data that shows that there's a plan that has gigabit service? And for the sort of statistical purposes of this address, we included all plans above 900 megabits per second download speed. So this is not strictly symmetrical gigs. So we're not even being super, stringent on the definition.
Important clarification there, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, many of the broadband geeks who follow our sites and may know this, but it bears repeating. The reason, or one of the core reasons why the FCC's Form 477 overstates coverage is that if broadband is at a given speed threshold is available at any address within a census block, it is considered available throughout that census block. So that's naturally going to overstate availability. That seems likely to be one factor for this difference. I was hypothesizing that, well, perhaps another is that current Form 477 rules allow providers to say they offer broadband service if they can provide it within 10 days, right? And that's sort of like, meaning it could be provisioned. You don't believe that has made much of an impact on this difference, Tyler, to the extent you can kind of pinpoint why the FCC's data is showing 84.4% and your data is showing 56.1%?
Hard to say, in terms of at scale, whether that plays in. I certainly think it does. I mean, again, one of the things that we mentioned in the report is that it's very possible that a large component of this is areas that have fiber build outs, but just not to the home, right? So we have fiber, to the curb or otherwise, or to the building, but then obviously that last mile connection may not be there. A lot of reasons for this, but I mean, yeah, I think it certainly plays a part. But I mean, again, when we're talking about statistical analysis of FCC data, it's impossible to ignore that 477 over reporting caveat.
Yeah. Well, I have two more big questions here I want to ask. One is about the level of competition that this brings, and you did report in here that in areas where gigabit service is available, pricing is stabilized somewhat. Median price for specific plans dropped by 27% from 109 in 2016 to 79.99 today. Do you have any kind of comment on that, on the pricing analysis, which of course is absent from FCC data? It's something you're adding in your collection of data, right, Tyler?
Certainly. And I'll note that's median pricing, right? So yeah, we're talking median pricing here, but yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I think that's an optimistic point on one end, because it shows that, I think even over the last 4 years, gigabit service has certainly normalized on the market, it seems, in many areas that have had it for that long, that areas that truly are, have been gigabit for a while. It seems now that, things like fiber are sort of starting to level out on the market. It's no longer a hyper premium service. It's something that's becoming more standard in many areas. Of course, we're talking primarily urban areas, of course. But yeah, I think that one part of this that, I feel anecdotally is true is how community broadband factors into this. So community broadband is, overwhelmingly fiber in most areas, and tends to have lower prices for that fiber connection as well. So that's, I think, obviously there's not enough community broadband in the US to really, change these numbers too much, but it's something that I think is a really interesting model, because it's, oftentimes if you have a community broadband service in your area, they'll actually outcompete, even cable providers on price, which is really interesting to see. But yeah, I think it's simple. It sounds simple, but I think as, gigabit service continues to expand, I think the pricing should and will go down. And I think that, having multiple fiber providers in a given zip code is still pretty rare. That's my feeling anyway. And I think that, as that continues to change, we should see more of this sort of stabilization relative to other technologies.
Well, and as a closeout point, Tyler, let's talk about, even if we did sort of downgrade the success story numbers of 3.9 to 84.4%, even if it did go from 2% to 56%, that's still a very dramatic improvement. And you do talk about how fiber availability has expanded and how we can make it universal. You highlight government assistance, right? Recent federal programs have really been emphasizing gigabit connectivity, municipal partnerships, which you've just mentioned, right? The role that municipalities play. And then you also mentioned smart infrastructure policy, including things like the dig once concept. Could you just talk about, again, we could look at this glass half empty or glass half full, but what are some takeaways that you see from America going from 2.4 to 56.1% gigabit availability over 4 years?
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, it's hard to stop progress, especially technological progress, right? I think that, no matter what happens, we are going to see this sort of tangible pull toward faster and better technologies. And right now, the end game for that is fiber, right? There's nothing that we can install as a physical infrastructure that's going to be better for the foreseeable future. So I think that everything you just said is right on the money. I mean, you have, many of the governmental programs over the past couple of years have incentivized gigabit speeds, which is, of course, creating a bit of a forcing function to move toward fiber, which is excellent. Since I've been interested in the topic of municipal broadband, it has certainly become more well-known and, among the general population, and the general idea of it has started to even shift from a policy standpoint. Obviously, now we have a lot of talk around things like open access networks and things of that nature, which are, of course, sort of changing this conversation. And at the same time, usually prioritizing gigabit services. But yeah, I think that, there's just the progress, like you said, is important to note that, I mean, it's there. We are seeing an improvement in gigabit availability. I just think it's important to understand, where that progress is happening and how, and then what can we do to sort of normalize that progress in every state, right? And make sure that gigabit is something that eventually is not a premium at all, right? It's just sort of more of a standard.
Exactly. Becoming more and more a necessity, a utility that is served through an array of alternatives and more competition. So Tyler, it's been a pleasure to have you on again. We look forward to covering more topics in future months, including ones about why we don't have or where we don't have universal coverage. And wanted to, again, we'll have a link to this on this page. Encourage you to check out this report from Broadband Now. Thank you on behalf of Tyler Cooper at Broadband Now. I'm Drew Clark at Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next month. Take care.